Poor girl paid a stranger's bus fare. She didn't know he was a millionaire CEO. The bus driver's voice cut through the cold night air. No money, no ride. He stood there, tall, stunned, and utterly out of place in his torn suit. Wind tugged at his collar as strangers glanced and looked away. She saw him standing like a statue carved out of pride and pain, her diner shoes still damp from a double shift, a handful of coins in her palm, just enough for her fare. But something inside her whispered, "Give." "I'll pay for him," Julia said, stepping forward. The heads turned, even the silence blinked. He looked at her, this girl with tired eyes and kindness stitched into every gesture. "You don't have to," he murmured. "I already did," she said softly, pressing the coins into the driver's hand. "Get on before he changes his mind." He got on. She sat by the window. Their eyes met once, brief, wordless, unforgettable. He never asked his name. If she didn't know, she'd just paid bus fare for the richest man in the city. He didn't see a billion when he stepped onto the bus. He just saw a man secure, lost, soaked through, and gripping nothing but his silence. Julia Ramos was used to reading people in seconds. Years behind the diner counter will do that to you. You learn how sadness clings to a person's shoulders, how disappointment lives in the way they fold napkins or stir coffee. And this man, whoever he was, had the look of someone whose whole life had just slipped through his fingers. It had been a long shift, the kind where your feet don't just ache, they plead. She had served omelets to students, poured bitter coffee for broken hearts, and cleaned ketchup off a crying toddler's shoe. Her last tip of the night had been 3 coins and a smile that didn't reach the eyes. He almost didn't notice him. He stood at the front of the bus, drenched and dazed. His black coat was soaked through and his hair clung to his forehead. He didn't fidget, he didn't plead. He simply stood there, silent, still, and stubborn. The driver didn't flinch. No fare, no ride. The man opened his mouth like he might argue, but no words came. Instead, his hand reached into an empty pocket. That's when Julia moved. He didn't know why. She just stepped forward, lifted her hand, and said the words before she could second-guess herself. "I'll pay for him." The world seemed to pause. The man turned slowly, as if he wasn't used to kindness sneaking up on him like that. "You don't have to," he said quietly, voice deep and unsure. "I already did," Julia replied. Her voice didn't shake, not because she wasn't tired or afraid, but because there are moments that teach you courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just a whisper that says, "Do the right thing, even if no one ever thanks you." He nodded gently and took a seat a few rows ahead of her. She didn't think much of it. People needed help. She had needed help once too, and no one had come. That's why she carried extra tissues in her coat, why she gave strangers directions even when she was late, and why she always kept her tips in quarters, just in case. He never even told her his name. But hours later, as she sank into bed beside her sleeping mother, that moment clung to her. She didn't know that the man she helped was William Stone, heir to Stone Hotels International, a man who once closed multi-million-dollar deals without blinking, but now couldn't even board a bus home. She didn't know his car had been stolen in a robbery 2 blocks away, or that his phone and wallet had vanished with it. That, for the first time in years, William Stone had no power, no protection, just rain and silence and one pair of aching feet. William didn't know her name. Didn't know she spent every evening walking home because her tips barely covered groceries, let alone gas. Didn't know that her mother, once the strongest woman in the world, was sick now, too tired to stand most days. All he knew was this. He helped without asking who he was. No strings, no selfies, no smiles meant to be remembered. Just kindness, quiet and real. And that's what haunted him. But William sat in the back of the bus that night and watched her reflection in the glass. She stared out the window, lost in thought, a tired halo of diner light still clinging to her hair. She didn't know it, but she had changed something in him. Because for the first time in his life, someone had helped him without knowing he was worth helping. No last name, no black card, no influence. Just a man in the rain. The next morning he woke with only one thought: find her. Nairobi softens here, like a memory warming the cold. Some stories don't begin with fireworks. Some begin with the smallest act of grace: a coin passed forward, a look held too long, a stranger not walking away. This story began with a girl who had nothing left to give and gave that away. Chapter 1. The Last Coins. Julia Ramos pressed her fingers around the warmth of the paper cup like it might somehow transfer life back into her bones. The coffee tasted burned, yesterday's grounds reheated into something dark and bitter. Still, she sipped. It was the kind of morning where even a bad cup of coffee was better than nothing. Her legs ached. Her apron was stiff from old syrup, and the thin soles of her sneakers had worn through just enough that she could feel the texture of the sidewalk beneath her feet. It was past 10 p.m., and the bus stop on 3rd and Alder was nearly empty. Just the flickering halo of a street lamp, the hiss of a vending machine behind her, and the occasional whir of passing traffic. His mother had been coughing again that morning, the kind of cough that hollowed out a person slowly. Julia had left 2 Tylenols by the bedside with a note that read, "Don't worry, I'll bring soup tomorrow." She didn't know where she'd get the soup, but she'd figure it out. She always did. She pulled her hand from her coat pocket and counted the coins one last time. 4 quarters, 3 dimes, 2 nickels, and a single copper penny, worn down until Lincoln's face was barely there. Exactly $1.15, enough for the bus ride home. No room for error. Behind her, footsteps approached, slow, hesitant, male. She didn't turn. Seattle nights were usually safe, but she'd learned to keep her eyes forward and her back straight. The bus rumbled toward them, headlights catching in the puddles at her feet. Julia stood up, brushed the damp from her knees, and stepped forward. The driver barely nodded as she dropped her change into the machine. She walked toward the back, clutching her bag like a shield. Then came the voice. Deep, hesitant, frustrated. "Look, I was robbed. I just need to get home, please." Julia turned. The man at the front of the bus stood tall but looked like the wind had tried to knock him over and almost succeeded. His suit jacket hung open, soaked through. His shoes were muddy. His face, sharp lines, unshaven, carried a look that didn't belong to someone used to asking for anything. The driver folded his arms. No cash, no ride, rules are rules. Julia watched the man hesitate. Then he turned, shoulders tight, jaw clenched like he'd rather walk 10 miles in the rain than argue. Something in her heart shifted. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the way he wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Maybe it was how pride and desperation held hands across his face. He stepped forward. "I'll pay for him," she said, her voice calm but clear. "The Drakurzi Greco Isho." Yes. She reached into her pocket and pulled out every last coin. Willem, though she didn't know his name yet, turned slowly to look at her. His eyes met hers, quiet and steady. "You don't have to," he said. "You already did." He dropped the coins into the machine. The bus hissed. The door closed. He stepped on, brushing water from his sleeves, and sat 2 rows ahead of her. Neither of them spoke. He didn't ask for his name. He didn't thank her again. The ride was quiet, save for the soft hum of tires and the occasional crackle of the radio. Julia rested her head against the glass, watching reflections pass like ghosts. Her shift had been long, and she knew she'd have to work another double tomorrow. But for now there was this silence, this strange, brief warmth. And him. He kept glancing over his shoulder, like he couldn't quite understand her. He looked out the window and smiled to herself. But when the bus stopped near her neighborhood, a low-lit stretch of duplexes and shuttered stores, she stood. He stood too. He said, voice quieter now, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she replied. "Good night." He stepped off into the cold without waiting for anything more. Across the city, inside a glass tower he could no longer access without ID, William Stone sat at a gas station cafe, staring at a paper napkin. He didn't know her note. He hadn't asked for his. And yet all he could think about was the way her voice sounded when she said, "I already did." He had spent his life surrounded by people who saw him before they saw him. Women smiled because they knew his net worth. Waiters remembered his orders because of his black card. Employees answered before he finished asking. But tonight a stranger with tired eyes and scuffed shoes had paid his fare with her last few coins, and expected nothing in return. He couldn't stop thinking about her face, the softness in her voice, the way she had looked through him like she didn't care who he was. For the first time in his adult life, he had been invisible. And yet she saw him. Back in her tiny bedroom, Julia peeled off her damp clothes and dropped them beside the space heater. She rubbed her arms and sat at the edge of her bed. A handwritten note sat on the nightstand from earlier that week. It was from her mother. In shaky handwriting it read, "I know it's hard, but don't stop being who you are, Mija. That's what makes you rare." Julia didn't feel rare. She felt like a worn-out waitress on the edge of disappearing. But tonight, for some reason, her heart was lighter. Maybe it was the look in that stranger's eyes, the way he seemed to come undone just enough to remind her she still had something to give. If she didn't know, she had just paid bus fare for a man who could have bought the whole damn city. And somewhere in that city, a man who once measured value in profits and projections. He was wondering what it meant to be seen by someone who expected nothing. This was how it began. Not with a kiss, not with fake, but with kindness. 115, Chapter 2, The Girl Behind the Counter. The scent of fresh bread and brewed coffee filled the air like a quiet promise. It was barely 7:15 Agitama Front with Diamond. The city had only just started to stretch its limbs. Most of downtown Seattle was still quiet. Julia wiped down the countertop for the third time that morning, more from muscle memory than necessity. Her hands moved automatically. Clean, stuck, pour, smile. Routine was her shield. It had been since her mother got sick. The morning crowd was predictable. 2 regulars with matching thermoses, a delivery driver who always asked for extra cream but no sugar, and Mrs. Henley, who still called her darling, even when scolding her for not wearing a thicker coat. But today, there was someone new. He walked in just past 7:30. His coat was dry now, dark wool double-breasted. His hair was brushed back with that careless neatness only the very rich or very exhausted ever pulled off. But Julia didn't notice that at first. He noticed his eyes. He looked around the diner not like he was lost, but like he was remembering something he'd only imagined. Their eyes met. Recognition flickered behind his expression, subtle but unmistakable. Julia's brow furrowed slightly. He looked familiar, but she couldn't place him. "Good morning," she said, setting down the coffee pot. "You looking for breakfast or just the warm air?" He smiled faintly, stepping toward the counter. "Coffee." He poured, no questions asked. He took the cup gently, fingers brushing the ceramic like it might tell him something. "I think we met last night," he said, not quite looking up. Julia paused, then studied him again. Her breath caught just slightly. The soaked man, the lost eyes. "You were on the 12, she said. "Downtown." He nodded. "You paid my fare." She shrugged. "You looked like you needed it." Their eyes locked again. Something passed between them, a fragile silence neither one knew how to break without ruining it. "And Willem," he said softly. "Julia." He nodded once, committing it to memory like it mattered. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, it did. He gestured toward the counter stools. "You can sit if you want. The seat near the window's the warmest when the sun hits." He sat, not at the window, but closer. For the next hour, William sat at that counter like he belonged there. He sipped his coffee, watching Julia move. The way she wiped down menus with her sleeve, how she leaned forward when the older man in the booth couldn't hear her, how she kept tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear only for it to fall again. It was chaos, the kind she had mastered, and he couldn't stop watching. "You run this place?" he asked as she passed again. Julia chuckled. "God, no. I just keep it standing most days." He smiled. "Feels like you own the walls." "I rent their good graces," she replied. "They fall apart if I stop sweet-talking them." He moved down the counter to refill another cup. William watched her go. He had been served by hundreds of people in his life. Luxury hotel concierges, first-class flight attendants. They all treated him the same. Julia didn't. She hadn't asked for his name. She didn't fawn, flatter, or flirt. She didn't know he was on the cover of Seattle Business Monthly last spring. She didn't know he once negotiated a $60 million 0-cents deal from a yacht in Monaco. To her, he was just William, a man who needed coffee, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. An hour passed. The morning crowd thinned. The music shifted to something soft and jazzy. Julia slid another refill across the counter. You've been nursing that same cup for 45 minutes. You planning to solve the world's problems in that mug? He looked up at her fully. I'm trying to remember the last time I felt this unimportant. He raised an eyebrow. Most people don't aim for that. I think I needed it, he said. Being invisible, I mean. She didn't laugh. She didn't look away. Instead, she nodded slowly. It could be a kind of freedom. He studied her. You ever feel that way? All the time, Julia replied. When you don't have much, people don't expect much from you. So you get to choose who you are. He leaned forward just slightly. And who are you, Julia? The question hit deeper than he intended. He hesitated. Right now? A waitress with $6 in tips, an exhausted mother at home, and a dream he'd been trying not to look at too closely. He tilted his head. Because I might realize it's still alive, she said quietly, and then I'll have to admit I'm afraid to chase it. He didn't respond, not with words. He would just looked at her like she was the most honest thing he'd seen in years. By the time William stood to leave, the light outside had turned gold. Morning was over. Life was beginning again. He reached for his wallet, then remembered. Still gone. He looked up sheepishly. I didn't bring anything. Again. Julia smirked, pouring one last splash of coffee into his cup. You've still got a tab, she said. Consider this part of the same deal. He laughed, shook his head. You always help strangers. Just the ones who look like they used to have everything and are trying to remember who they are without it. He stared at her. Beer dangerous. I'm tired, she replied. But's even worse. As he pushed open the diner door, the bell chimed behind him. Oh, she didn't know yet. Didn't know the man she'd just shared a quiet morning with was William James Stone III, heir to the most exclusive hotel line on the West Coast. Didn't know his face would be in the papers again next week for a strategic merger in Tokyo. Didn't know his father had already left 4 voicemails, asking why he hadn't come home. He just knew he liked his coffee black, his silences long, and his smile shy. And somehow, that was enough. For now. Some people meet at parties. Some meet through apps, or introductions, or fate. But the rarest kind of meeting is the one you never planned. A moment at a bus stop. A cup of burnt coffee. A kindness given without cost. He had no name when she paid his fare. And now he couldn't stop searching for hers. Chapter 3. A name for the coffee. 3 mornings later, William returned. No longer drenched, no longer disoriented. This time he knew exactly where he was going, and exactly who he was looking for. He stepped through the diner door just after the breakfast rush. A chime announced his arrival, followed by the gentle hum of low conversation and the clatter of ceramic mugs. There she was. Julia stood behind the counter, hair tied up in a makeshift bun, sleeves rolled, a pencil tucked behind one ear like a forgotten thought. She was balancing a tray of coffee cups, taking orders, refilling sugar jars, like she was 5 people folded into one. William smiled. He didn't understand it, not fully, but something about this small space, this girl, kept tugging at his thoughts like gravity. He didn't need a reason, he just needed to be near it again. He waited until the counter was clear, then took the same seat as last time. Julia noticed him after a moment and paused. A surprised smile danced briefly across her lips, the kind that flickers before a person has time to hide it. You again? She asked, wiping her hands on her apron. I couldn't resist the ambiance, he replied, and I think I'm starting to miss your sarcasm. He poured his coffee before he could ask, black with a dash of warmth. Still know the wallet? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill. I found this under my car seat. I figured it earned me at least one cup. Julia placed the mug in front of him with a flourish. Welcome back, Mr. Moneybags. He smirked. Do I at least get a name on my coffee this time? She tilted her head, amused. You want one of those foam hearts too? No, he said a little too quickly. Just the name. Julia grabbed a napkin, scribbled something in red ink and slid it across the counter. Will you? He stared at it, then laughed. You really don't let people off easy, do you? I've got a strict naming policy, she replied. No backstory, no latte art. Just honest labels. Fair enough, he said, but I think you missed a detail. She raised an eyebrow. You forgot to put grateful in there. Julia's smile softened. Just a little. The morning unfolded slowly. He stayed through the tail end of breakfast, sipping coffee like it was something sacred. Julia moved around him, busy, focused, alive in her element. But every few minutes she found herself glancing toward him, just to make sure he hadn't left. William asked her small things, how long she'd worked there, what kind of music they played when the place was closed, whether the old man in booth 3 came in every day or only when it rained. She answered honestly, no polish, no practiced charm. It felt good to talk to someone who wasn't trying to impress or manipulate or calculate. It felt. You ever get tired of this place? He asked during a lull. Julia leaned on the counter, the shadows under her eyes more honest than anything she said aloud. Sometimes, she admitted, but it's stable, and stability's underrated. He nodded quietly. She looked at him then, really looked, not the way she had before when he was just a stranger on a bus, but now there was a familiarity in the silence between them. You're not from around here, she said. No, he replied, but I've been around long enough to know this place has better coffee than my boardroom. Org. The word slipped out too easily. Julia narrowed her eyes. So you work at... He hesitated just for a second. Hospitality, sort of. Into 6. You could say that. He nodded slowly. You don't... He chuckled. That's because I'm not wearing one right now. He leaned in slightly. What about you? Always dreamed of slinging coffee and surviving off tips? Actually, she trailed off, surprised by her own willingness to share. No. I wanted to open a bakery, a real one, with big windows, warm light, and those little hand-painted chalk signs. William watched her eyes light up as she said it, that quiet flicker of a dream still burning even under layers of exhaustion. What's stopping you? He asked. Julia gave a one-shoulder shrug. Life, bills, reality, take your pick. He looked down at his mug, tracing the rim with his finger. Maybe reality just needs better coffee. He laughed, surprised by the sound of it coming from her own mouth. When the door opened an hour later and more customers streamed in, Julia returned to her routine. William stood to go. He placed the crumpled $5 bill under the mug and added another napkin beside it. This time he scribbled something back in the same red pen. Julia, the girl who paid without asking. He found it after he left, and for the first time in weeks. Some names don't need to be written on cups. Some are engraved quietly in gestures, in silences, in the moments no one else sees. He didn't tell her his last name, though she didn't ask. But somehow that made it all feel more real. The girl behind the counter was no longer just a stranger. And the bus guy was no longer just a... Chapter 4. The Light in the Silence. Julia noticed it on the Wednesday. The little things. It wasn't anything dramatic. No scandal, no newspaper headline, no sudden reveal of a penthouse or a private car. Just Bill. The way he spoke about wine regions without ever looking them up. The way he instinctively calculated prices, travel times, and tipped exact percentages, as though he'd never had to guess a day in his life. The first time he mentioned the peninsula, he didn't mean a local park. He meant Hong Kong. The way he moved, shoulders relaxed, but deliberate, every gesture confident, every silence held a beat too long, like he was trained to own rooms even when he wasn't trying to. Julia knew wealth when she saw it, not the kind that wears fake Rolexes or drives rented convertibles. No, this was the quiet kind, the old kind, the kind that doesn't try to impress because it doesn't have to. And that morning, as William sat at the counter sketching something on a napkin, a floor plot, a cafe layout, she saw it again. Elegance, restraint, and lies. It wasn't that he said anything wrong. It was what he didn't say. She'd asked a simple question. So, where exactly do you work? He glanced up, smiled, and said the words too smoothly. In hospitality, some hotel stuff, bit of real estate here and there. He blinked. Welcome to corporate life, he joked, sipping his coffee. But Julia didn't laugh this time. Instead, she leaned on the counter and said, "You talk like a guy who's hiding something." It would made him awe. He didn't deny it. He didn't confess either. He just looked at her with that unreadable expression, part boyish charm, part locked vault. "Let's just say I like keeping certain things simple," he finally said. And just like that, the moment passed. But it stayed with her. Later that evening, Julia walked home through the wet city streets, her coat buttoned up to her chin, her head full of static. He wasn't just some guy. He knew that now. In work, he didn't want her to know. She stopped in front of the bakery 2 blocks from her apartment, the one with the for lease sign in the window. The glass was dusty. The lights inside were dead. But in her mind she could still see it. Warm golden shelves, the smell of cinnamon, her mother at the window seat. It had been a dream once, still was maybe. And William, he had stirred something in her, something she hadn't let herself feel in years. But now, he wasn't sure what was real anymore. The next morning he was waiting outside the diner before she even arrived, leaning against the brick wall like it was something casual, like he hadn't been pacing for 15 minutes. He paused a few feet away, heart already guarded. "Early," she said. "I wanted to see you before your shift," he replied. He nodded once, unlocking the door and flipping the sign to open. Inside, he followed her to the counter. "You've got something to ask you," he said quietly. He glanced up, busying herself with the coffee machine. "Go ahead." "I'm working on a new project," he said. "Something different, smaller. Something that matters." "Okay. And it's in a coastal town outside the city. I'm thinking of opening a hotel." Her eyebrows lifted. "It was a cafe inside," he added, "something real. Community-focused." She stared at him, unsure where this was going. "I want you to run the bakery." Silence. Julia slowly placed the mug down and wiped her hands on her apron. "Excuse me. You said you had a dream, a bakery of your own. Well, what if this is how we make that happen?" Julia didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked, "And how exactly do you plan to open this hotel?" William hesitated. Then, "I have resources." "Resources?" she echoed, incredulous. "What does that even mean?" He looked at her, really looked. His face shifted, not in guilt, but in grief, like someone caught between 2 lives. "I didn't lie to you, Julia. You just never told the truth." A beat passed. He stepped back from the counter. "Who are you, William?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. He finally said the words he'd been avoiding. "My name is William Stone." Her hand stopped moving. Julia felt like someone had knocked the air from her lungs. We knew that name. Everyone in Seattle knew that name. 2 Stone hotels. The multi-billion-dollar family empire that practically built half the city skyline. "You're that William Stone?" she whispered. He nodded once. And just like that, the room felt too small for both of them. For a long moment she didn't. When she finally did, her voice was quiet, fractured. "You came in here every morning, pretended to be just some guy. You let me think you were—" He couldn't finish. William stepped forward. "No," she cut in. "You did it to feel normal. To run from whatever pressure or legacy or money is choking you, and you used me to do it. It's not true, isn't it?" She was shaking now, not from anger, but from disappointment. From the slow realization that the thing she had started to believe in, this tender, honest beginning, was built on a story he never told her. "I didn't want the way you saw me to change," he said, "but you never gave me the choice to decide." That was the line that broke him. He had thought he was protecting something fragile. Instead, he had buried it. He didn't chase her when she stepped into the back room. He just stood there, silently still, and for the first time since they met, completely alone. Trust doesn't break loudly. It shatters in silence. He had told himself lies weren't lies if they came from fear. What Julia? He had given him nothing but truth. And now he was the one walking out of her life, without needing to move at all. Chapter 5. The name he never said. Julia didn't cry when he left. She didn't slam the door or scream. She just stood there, still and hollow, her hands wrapped around the edge of the stainless steel sink like it could hold her up. Outside, the morning sun poured through the diner windows like nothing had changed. But everything had. He'd spent her whole life choosing honesty. It hadn't made her rich or lucky or even safe, but it was hers. And when William had walked into her life with his silence and soft eyes, she had let him in, believing he was just like her. But he wasn't. She had served 1,000 people coffee, and somehow, the one who meant the most had offered the least of himself. She had given him her name freely. He'd never given her his. That afternoon, the city seemed louder, brighter, and far more indifferent. Julia walked past the bakery she always paused at, the one with the dusty for-lease sign and dreams hiding behind frosted glass. But she didn't stop. She couldn't, because now that dream wasn't hers alone. It had been touched by him. His idea, his offer, his money. And now even her dream felt tainted. Across town, high above the city, William stood in a corner office made of glass and silence. The skyline he once admired looked gray now, not from clouds, but from memory. James Stone, his father, stood across from him with folded arms and a look that cut like steel. "You've been gone for days," James said. "The board is nervous. Tokyo needs confirmation. And you disappear into diners and fairy tales." William said nothing. His father moved closer, voice like gravel. "Is this about a girl?" Still, Raul said nothing. James laughed, the kind that carried no warmth. "I warned you. You step too far into the world below, you forget who you are." "I didn't forget who I am," he said. "I remembered who I used to be." The next morning, the diner felt colder. Julia moved through the motions, her body doing one thing while her mind stayed elsewhere. Her regulars noticed but said nothing. The stool near the window, his stool, stayed empty. Every time the bell above the door rang, her heart flinched. But it was never him. She should have hated him. She wanted to. But what hurt most wasn't the lie. It was that he dared come back to explain. He let her walk away with every wound. And now he was gone. 3 days passed. Then 4. Julia buried herself in work, in her mother's tea, in the quiet. But even silence, when shared long enough with someone, becomes a language. And now, every second that passed without him felt like a word unsaid. Then came the night the television changed everything. She was refilling napkin dispensers, half listened to the local evening news crackling in the corner of the diner. And in corporate headlines, William Stone of Stone Hotels was seen at the opening gala of their flagship luxury resort in Kyoto last night. Rumors continue to swirl around his anticipated promotion to global CEO, despite his recent absence. Julia turned toward the screen. There he was, in a tuxedo, standing beneath chandeliers and beside diplomats. He smiled, effortless, untouched. Her hands went still. The image cut to him shaking hands, cameras flashing. This wasn't the man who had sipped burnt coffee at her counter. This wasn't the man who'd asked her to run a bakery by the sea. This was someone who had a life so far from hers, it didn't even exist in the same world. And yet, he had kissed her hand like it mattered. He had laughed like no one was watching. He had spoken of dreams like he was starving for them. Now he was back to ballrooms and glass towers. While she stood in her apron, she didn't wait for the next shift to end. She tossed her apron on the hook, wiped her hands, and the Queen to Queen took 20 minutes, then a cab 5 more. When she reached the steps of Stone Enterprises, she stared up at the building like it might swallow her whole. But she didn't flinch. He walked through the revolving doors with steady feet. It could have but she said the name clearly, Willem Stone. And somehow that was enough. The elevator clanged. Too loud. Too late. When the doors opened on the top floor, she stepped into silence. A woman at the desk looked up, startled. "I need to speak to him," Julia said. Before she could be questioned further, a voice echoed from the hallway. "Let her in." It was him. William stood in the center of the office, tie loose, jacket off, sleeves rolled. His face held exhaustion, regret, and something else. "Oh." Julia stepped forward, arms crossed. "So this is who you really are." He nodded. "Yeah." "And you weren't going to tell me?" "I was scared," he said. "Of what?" Her voice cracked. "That I'd leave if I knew the truth?" He hesitated, then, "That you'd stop seeing me the way you did." She stared at him, eyes burning. "You know what hurts the most," she said. "It's not the lie. It's that you made me feel like I could trust you, like I could believe in someone again." He took a breath. "I made a mistake." "No," she whispered. "You made a choice." Silence stretched between them. Then she turned. "I don't belong in your world, William." He called after her, softly. "Neither do I." He paused, but didn't look back. Some names are spoken too late. Some truths are held too long. And when love is offered in pieces, sometimes the ones who need it most are the first to walk away. She gave him honesty. All he had to give was the name he never said. Chapter 6. The one who walked. It had been 6 days since she walked away. Sunrises that felt too quiet. 6 nights William didn't sleep. 6 mornings without her coffee. And without her. The silence she left behind was louder than any fight they could have had. He hadn't realized how much space she took up in his life until it was empty. It wasn't just the conversations, the quick wit, or the way her laugh cracked through his defenses like light under a locked door. It was her presence. Her honesty. The way she saw him, really saw him, before she ever knew his last name. And now all she saw was betrayal. William stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the city stretching endlessly before him. He had everything he thought he wanted, the title, the corner office, the legacy. But none of it meant anything anymore. Not after her. He had built his life like a fortress. Concrete, steel, impressive from the outside, but cold. And in just a few weeks, Julia had walked through the front gates without even trying. And now he stood in the ashes of what he didn't know how to hold on to. Across the city, Julia sat by the window in her mother's living room. The television buzzed quietly in the background, showing a smiling William on some business channel again. She turned it off. He didn't need a reminder of the version of him the world adored. He had seen the other version, the real one, and even that version had kept something from her. Her mother walked into the room and sat beside her, noticing the hollow stillness in her eyes. "Was he cruel to you?" her mother asked gently. "No," Julia whispered. "That's the worst part. He wasn't." "Then why are you hurting like this?" "Because he lied, and I was starting to think I'd finally found someone who didn't." Her mother held her hand, thumb stroking softly. "Sweetheart, Sometimes people don't lie to hurt us. Sometimes they lie because they're afraid they're not enough when they tell the truth. Julia blinked. But that's still a choice. Yes, her mother said, but it's a human one. At Stone Enterprises, the board was expecting a decision. The CEO seat had been offered, formally this time. It was his. But William didn't respond. Instead, he walked out of the boardroom in the middle of the meeting, ignoring the buzz of phones and the irritation of billionaires. James Stone followed him down the hallway. You walk away from this now and you undo 20 years of preparation, his father snapped. William turned to face him. You spent 20 years preparing me for everything except what it means to actually live. James narrowed his eyes. And what does that mean to you now? William's answer was quiet, but firm. Building something that's mine, from the ground up, something that doesn't come with a boardroom or a bloodline. James scoffed. Because of a girl in an apron? No, William said. Because of the man I became when she was in the... The next morning, Julia walked past the corner bakery again. But this time she stopped. There was a new sign on the window. Not for me. Just one sheet of paper, handwritten in bold black marker. Renovations begin soon. He stared at it, heart pounding. And beside the door frame a note taped to the glass. Julia, if you're still dreaming of warm light and cinnamon bread, come see what we can build. He stood there, stunned. For the first time in days, the tightness in her chest loosened. Just a little. That night, William drove to the site of the old bakery. The door was unlocked. Inside, he found already there. She stood in the center of the dusky room, arms crossed, hair falling loose around her face. You bought it, she said softly. He nodded. I did. And what, you think that fixes everything? No, he said, but I think it's a start. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. Why? He didn't smile, didn't perform. He just stepped forward and said what he should have said from the beginning. Because I want to build a life that means something, and every version of that life has you in it. Silence. Julia's eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. I don't care about your name, William, she said. I care about what it stands for. He nodded slowly. Then let me show you. He didn't need forgiveness to change. He just needed to believe he was still allowed to try. And she didn't need perfection to trust again. Just proof that someone was willing to fight for the truth. Sometimes the one who walks away is also the one who knows how to come back. Chapter 7, What I Choose. William sat alone at the long walnut conference table, the room around him polished and still. A dozen chairs sat empty, reminders of the men who had tried to build an empire for him, not with him. He reached into the folder in front of him and reread the official offer letter for the global CEO seat. It was everything he had once believed mattered. Legacy, control, legacy again. But it didn't feel like power anymore. It felt like a cage. He thought of Julia's voice when she said, "You made me believe I could trust someone again." And how he'd broken that without even meaning to. Later that morning, he stepped into his father's office. James Stone looked up from behind a wall of financial reports. Well? William placed the envelope on the table. What's this? The silence that followed felt longer than it was. You're turning down the company? James asked, voice dangerously calm. I'm turning down a life I never... His father stood, pacing slowly. You walk away from this and you become a man with no seat at the table. I don't need the table, William replied. I'll build my own. James stared at him. For what, for a girl? For myself, William said quietly. But yes, she showed me who that is. Later he stood in the middle of the old bakery, covered in dust and life and risk. Julia walked in with a folder of sketches, blueprints, and a rolled-up lease agreement under her arm. They didn't speak right away. They just stood in the hollow of their shared maybe, a dream neither of them was brave enough to chase alone. Finally, Julia broke the silence. Are you sure about this? William turned to her. I've never been more sure of anything. He studied him, uncertain. "You gave up everything." "No," he said, stepping closer. "I finally claimed something." He hesitated. "This isn't just a project, you know that, right?" He nodded. "It's a small one," she whispered. "The kind that mutters." His gaze turned into weeks. The bakery took shape from the inside out. Julia chose the tile, William picked the chairs. Together they painted walls and sanded windowsills and argued over pie display cases. They shared stories late into the night, over coffee on the floor and boxes of pastries that didn't make it past the test batch. William learned how to burn croissants and scrape sugar off the stovetop. Julia learned how to lean into the quiet, the good kind. One night they sat under hanging lights that hadn't been wired yet. The stars blinked through the open rafters. William held a clipboard in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. "You know," he said, "I spent years in rooms where every decision came with a decimal and a lawyer." Julia smiled, head resting on her knees. "And now I care more about the name on the bakery than the name on the building." He turned his head toward him. "You still want to call it La Dolce Vita?" He nodded. "The sweet life." Julia sighed. "I used to think the sweet life was something people like you already had." He looked at her. Turns out it was something he had to find. The next morning the first official sign was delivered. Julia stepped out to see it. Clean, simple, hand-lettered. The Dolce Cafe and Bakery. By Julia Ramos and William Stone. She stared at it for a long time. Because of the name, but because it was hers. The life that belonged to her. Built with someone who had every reason to stay where it was safe, but chose instead to come here. Yes. It to her. That night William lit the last bulb over the counter and turned to face her. "I've been thinking about something," he said, voice quieter than usual. Julia looked up from a tray of test pastries. "That's dangerous." He smiled. "I want to invest in something else." She raised an eyebrow. "What now?" He stepped closer. "You," he said. "Us. Not with money. With time. With a life." She blinked. "I don't just want to build this business with you," he continued. "I want to build the rest of it too, whatever it becomes." Her lips parted. "You're not just saying that because I make perfect scones." "I'm saying it because I haven't been able to breathe right since you walked out of my life," he said. "And because I finally know what it feels like to want something, not because I'm expected to, but because I can't imagine anything else." She didn't answer right away, but she didn't move either. Instead, she placed her hand over his. "Let's show me," she said softly. "Sometimes love is a grand gesture. Sometimes it's the simple act of walking away from what's expected and toward what sets you free." He had power. She had truth. Together they had choice. This time they chose each other. Chapter 8. La Dolce Vita. The front windows gleamed like something sacred. Outside, the morning sun spilled onto the sidewalk. Inside, the scent of warm bread and cinnamon clung to every corner of the newly opened bakery like memory. Julia stood behind the counter, apron tied, sleeves rolled, eyes wide with disbelief. It still didn't feel real. After everything, the lies, the silence, the heartbreak, the rebuilding, they were here. Open. A simple sign in the window. But La Dolce Vita, she whispered aloud. There's the sweet life, not the one she thought she had to chase. The one they had chosen to create. The first customers came slowly. A neighbor with her daughter, a man who worked at the bookstore down the street, an elderly woman who used to own a flower shop and cried when she tasted Julia's lemon loaf. Word spread, not fast, but steady. People came for the pastries. They stayed for the feeling. There was something in the air here, something warmer than just ovens and light fixtures. It was something human. William worked quietly in the background. He wasn't the kind of partner who needed to be seen. He was the kind who filled the coffee beans, fixed the leaky faucet, and wiped down tables with a quiet joy that surprised even him. Some customers recognized him, a few even asked, "Are you that William stuff?" He would only smile and say. Julia watched him with cautious admiration, still learning to believe it was real, still guarding the last pieces of her heart. But every day that he showed up, not with flowers or apologies, but with effort, the walls inside her softened. One evening, the two of them sat at the small round table near the back. The bakery closed, the lights dimmed. William reached into a folder and pulled out a notebook. Inside were scribbles, ideas, clippings from old menus, notes from their early nights dreaming together. "Do you remember the first time you told me about this place?" he asked. Julia nodded. "You sat on that stool drinking burnt coffee and told me I deserved something more." He smiled. "Turns out we both did." She looked at him then, really looked. The man who once hid behind a last name now stood beside her like a man without armor, just skin and heart and choice. "You're different now," she said. And me corrected. They fell into a rhythm. Morning prep together. Midday rush with smiles en fleur on their cheeks. Evenings with soft music playing, hands brushing against each other while cleaning up. No declaration, no promises, just presence. And presence, they were learning, was its own kind of vow. A month in, they received their first review in a local paper. The headline read, "La Dolce Vita is more than a bakery. It's a home with a front door open to everyone." Julia clipped it and taped it above the register. William watched her quietly. That night he stepped behind her while she was restocking shelves, slipped his arms around her waist and whispered, Looks good on you." He turned, forehead rising against his chest. "I was scared it would all fall apart," she confessed. "I still am," he said, "but if it does, we'll rebuild it. Together." He pulled back slightly, searching his face. "And if I fall apart? Not to stay until you remember how to stand again." They didn't talk about marriage yet. Or forever. They just kept showing up. Every morning. Every night. Until one afternoon, as they cleaned up after a thunderstorm that had knocked out the power and soaked the floor, Julia sat cross-legged on the counter, dripping wet and laughing. William leaned against the wall, equally soaked, watching her like she was sunlight. "You know," he said, "you never asked me why I picked this town." He tilted his head. "I figured it had something to do with your childhood, or maybe it was just a good real estate deal." He shook his head. "No," he said, "it was the first place I remembered dreaming of something small." Julia blinked. "I was 8, he continued. "My parents brought me here for a weekend. I watched a woman behind the counter at a cafe make pastries while her son swept the floor. She looked happy, really happy. Not rich, not famous, just content." He looked down at his hands. He chose to change. That night they danced barefoot in the kitchen. No music, just the hum of the refrigerator and the steady pulse of their hearts. And in that small space, with the world locked outside, Julia whispered the words she hadn't dared to say. "You're falling in love with this life." William touched her cheek, soft as, "But let's keep building it, one small moment at a time." Not all lives are built from scratch. Some are baked slow, folded gently, served with time and heat. What they had now wasn't perfect, but it was real, and real was finally enough. Chapter 9. You Deserve the Sky. It was nearly closing time when the knock came. Not the bell over the door, not the chime of a new customer, but a knock, firm, measured. Julia glanced up from behind the counter, dusting powdered sugar off her apron. William looked toward the door and froze. A man stood there in a charcoal gray suit. His expression was polished, familiar. Too familiar. James Stone. The man who had built an empire, demanded legacy, and walked away from softness the minute it showed its face. "May I come in?" James asked, eyes sharp but not cold. Julia nodded, unsure. William stepped forward. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see for myself what was worth giving up the world I gave you." His voice held no accusation. Just curiosity. James walked slowly through the bakery. He took in the hand-painted chalkboard menu, the antique clock on the wall, the mismatched chairs, the faint scent of vanilla and cinnamon. "You always did hate marble floors," he murmured. William stayed silent. Finally, James turned to him. "She's beautiful," he said softly. "And this place, it's not what I imagined." "It's not supposed to be," William replied. "You turned down your seat for this," James said, gesturing to the shop. "You understand how small this is compared to what you could have?" Julia bristled behind the counter. But William didn't flinch. "I don't need big anymore," he said. "I just need what's mine." James nodded once, a slow, surprised gesture. He turned to Julia. "Thank you," he said. He blinked. "For what?" "For reminding my son that joy isn't something you inherit. It's something you build." After he left, William stood at the window long after the man disappeared down the street. Julia came to his side. "You okay?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "I think I am." "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The other life?" William turned toward her, eyes steady. "Sometimes I miss how easy it was to hide." She studied him quietly. "But now," he continued, brushing his hand with his fingers, "I'd rather be seen, even if it's harder." That weekend they hosted their first community brunch. Word had spread about the little cafe with heart, and soon the bakery was full not just of regulars, but of strangers who would become friends. Julia moved through the room like light itself, balancing trays, laughing easily, greeting everyone like she'd known them forever. William watched her from behind the counter. The woman approached him, older, stylish, with eyes that saw through most things. "Are you the Mr. Stone?" she asked gently. He nodded. "I am." He smiled. "She talks about you like you're still the boy on the bus." He smiled back. "Some days I still feel like him." "He loves you, you know." His breath caught. Just slightly. "I hope so," he said. "She does," the woman said. "You can see it in how she leans toward your voice when you speak, in how her eyes soften when she thinks you're not looking." William looked over. Julia was laughing with a young boy, handing him a cookie the size of his face. She looked up, and for a second, one breath, one blink, she looked at him the way he always hoped someone would. "Like home." That night they walked along the boardwalk just outside of town. The sea whispered against the shore. The sky above them blushed gold and lavender. William reached into his pocket, heart racing. He didn't kneel. He didn't need to. He just took her hand and placed a small, delicate velvet box in it. Julia opened it. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, nothing flashy, a single diamond set in rose gold. He stared at it, then up at him. "I don't need an answer yet," he said, voice low. "But I needed you to know, I'm not going anywhere." Tears welled in her eyes, not out of fear, but from how safe she suddenly felt. "I'm not afraid of the sky anymore," she whispered. He pulled her gently against his chest. "That's because you were always meant to fly." Back at the bakery, taped beside the register, a new note appeared the next day. "Real love doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be chosen, daily, kindly, truly." Customers read it as they paid for coffee and cake. Jim smiled. Some nodded. And some, the ones who had waited their whole lives for a quiet kind of love, finally believed it might still find them too. She had offered him bus fare. He had offered her a life. Not the one built from stone and steel, but the one built from gentle mornings and second chances. And now, at last, she knew. He didn't just deserve coffee and kindness. He deserved the sky. Chapter 10. The Ring in the Apron Drawer. Julia didn't say yes right away. The ring sat in the top drawer of her apron shelf for 3 days, nestled between a roll of parchment paper and her grandmother's biscuit cutter. She hadn't touched it, but she hadn't hidden it either. He saw it each morning, felt its quiet weight, without ever picking it up. It wasn't because she didn't love him. It was because this was the first time in her life Love felt like a choice. Not a rescue, not a rush, not a fix. A choice. And she wanted to be sure she was choosing with her whole heart. William didn't ask again. He didn't press. Instead, he showed up like always, rolling up his sleeves before the shop opened, pouring coffee, restocking the napkin holders she always forgot. And every evening when they closed the bakery together, he walked her home like it was their first date. Every time. He wasn't waiting for an answer. He was just showing her that no matter what she said, he wasn't going anywhere. The bakery's 1-month anniversary came quietly. No party, no head, just handwritten thank you notes taped to the door from neighbors. A middle schooler brought a flower he'd picked from the sidewalk. An elderly man slipped a $20.00 tip into the jar and whispered, "For your honesty. We don't get that much anymore." And as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Julia stood behind the counter, apron dusted in flour, eyes full of a kind of peace she hadn't felt in years. He pulled out the drawer. He looked at the ring, and smiled. That night, William returned from dropping off a delivery. He stepped into the bakery expecting to find her cleaning up. Instead, the lights were dimmed, soft jazz playing low from the old radio in the corner. A single candle flickered on the back table, beside a plate of warm blueberry scones and 2 chipped mugs of tea. And on top of the table, the ring, not Nick's box, was there. Wait. William stood still in the doorway, heart. Julia stepped out from the kitchen, apron still on, hair pulled up messily. "You didn't say anything." He walked over, took his hand and placed it over hers. He whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." He stared at her, eyes shimmering. "You're sure?" "I'm more than sure," she said. "I'm ready." He slipped the ring onto her finger, slow, Robert, then kissed her, not like the start of something, but like a promise. Brett he began, finally released. They didn't plan a grand wedding. No fancy venue, no orchestra. Just a quiet ceremony at the pier, barefoot in the sand, her mother crying softly in the front row. William wore a white shirt and rolled sleeves. Julia wore a cotton dress with wildflowers tucked behind her ear. The tally showed up the florist, the barista from 2 blocks over, the boy who always ordered hot chocolate with extra whipped cream. They threw flower petals from paper cups and clapped like the world had just been reset. And in that golden hour light, with the sea whispering in the background, Julia looked into William's eyes and said the words she never thought she'd be brave enough to say. "This was the life I didn't even know how to ask for." Afterward, they returned to the bakery, now closed for the day, and danced to the radio in the back room. No music they'd picked. Whatever was playing. And that, they both agreed, was perfect. A week later, a woman came into the bakery, clearly from the city, tailored coat, sharp eyes. He stared at the sign above the counter. "You're the Stones," she said. "I read about you." William stepped forward, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "We're just William and Julia here." He looked around at the photos on the wall, at the chalkboard menu. "At first I didn't believe it," she said, "that someone would leave all that money and legacy to open a small-town cafe." Julia smiled gently. "Some things are worth more." The woman nodded once. "I think you're right." He ordered a scone and left a tip bigger than the bill. The seasons changed. Summer drifted into fall. The mornings came with crisp air and the William added a cider recipe to the menu. Julia introduced a rosemary shortbread that had people lining up before 8 a.m. And every once in a while, when she opened the drawer where she used to keep that ring, he found a folded napkin. A new note. Simple things. Oh, he looked like sunshine. What? Thoughts for believing in us before I knew how. Orja, I love being yours. And she cooked everyone. She had once given him a car. He had once given her a window into a world she never trusted. But together they gave each other the one thing no one else had. Not in a palace. Not in a hotel. Not in a glass tower. but in a small bakery where love didn't need to be announced. It shone every day, in the way he took her hand, in the way she folded his notes, and in the way she wore the ring she once kept in the drawer beside the sugar and drink. The life measured in small things. Years from now, no one will remember the color of her apron. They won't remember the exact date the bakery opened or how many blueberry muffins sold that first week. They won't know that she once paid a stranger's bus fare with the last of her coins, not because she had enough to give, but because she couldn't imagine not giving. They won't remember how he stood in the rain without a wallet, stripped of everything but his name, and still couldn't. Or she won't remember, because love, when it's real, lives in the smallest moments. In how he restocked the sugar when no one asked. In how she always left a corner muffin unwrapped for the boy down the block who came in after school and pretended he could pay. In how the world kept spinning, but they kept choosing each other, every morning, like clockwork. Julia once thought she had to chase love in grand gestures, in someone who could save her, lift her, give her a name. But it turned out she already had one. He just needed someone who saw it. Not because she was impressive, but because she was enough. William had spent a lifetime being Olaf. Photo. Quoted. He had been called visionary, cold, brilliant, dangerous, and never safe. Until her. Until Julia poured burnt coffee into a chipped mug and said with her tired eyes and calm voice, "You better get on before he changes his mind." He hadn't known it then. But she didn't just pay his bus fare that night. She shook out his future. Love didn't come to them with fireworks or orchestras. It came in flour-stained fingers. Late-night floor plans scribbled on pizza boxes. Notes folded inside Apron. It came in apology, in patience, in presence. And for the first time in both their lives, it stayed. Now, if you were to walk past a certain small-town bakery on any given morning, you might see a couple inside. He's wiping down the tables, humming something off-key. He's behind the counter, hair up, laughing softly at something only he heard. There's a ring on her finger now, worn, warm, never flashy. And on the wall beside the register, a sign that reads, La Dolce Vita. The sweet life. Not because life is permanent, but because it's theirs. If you've ever been the girl who gave too much, if you've ever been the man afraid to speak his truth, if you've ever watched someone walk away, or walked away yourself, because love felt too fragile to hold, then maybe, just maybe, you'll understand what it meant when she paid the fare. And when he stayed. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever fallen in love with someone before you even knew their name? What's a small, quiet act of love you'll never forget? And if someone once believed in you when you didn't believe in yourself, tell us what that meant. Your story might help someone else heal. So from our little corner of the world to yours, thank you for believing in second chances, and in the quiet kind of that changes everything.